2.6 million years ago, in a stretch of dry, sun-baked land in what is now Ethiopia's Afar region, our family tree was far more crowded than you've ever been told. If you grew up with the image most of us did, a hunched ape slowly straightening up, step by step, into a modern human, one species quietly replacing the next in an orderly line, you were taught a story that fossil evidence has now almost completely dismantled. Because at this exact place, in this exact window of time, we now know that as many as 4 different human relative species were alive on Earth at once. Not one evolving into the next in a tidy sequence. 4, walking the same rivers, competing for the same fruit trees and roots, possibly even crossing paths with one another at the very same moment in history. Some of them left no descendants at all. Their entire lineage simply ends. One of them, eventually, led to us. And for most of the last century, scientists didn't even know they'd missed this. The fossil record from this period was so thin, so fragmented, that researchers had no way of knowing just how many separate experiments evolution was quietly running at once, all in the same small corner of Africa. This is the story of how a handful of fossil teeth, pulled from Ethiopian sediment in the last 2 years, rewrote one of the most fundamental assumptions in all of human evolution, and why the real shape of our family tree looks less like a ladder, and a lot more like a crowded, tangled, and mostly extinct forest. For most of us, the mental image of human evolution comes from one very specific illustration, a row of figures walking left to right, each one a little taller, a little straighter, a little less hairy than the one before it, until you reach a modern human standing fully upright on the far right edge. It's called the March of Progress, and it's one of the most reproduced scientific images in history. It's also, according to nearly every paleoanthropologist alive today, deeply misleading. The image implies something evolution simply doesn't do, a single, tidy, one-directional path, with each species neatly replacing the one before it like a relay race. Real evolution doesn't work in straight lines. It works in branches, messy, overlapping, and frequently unsuccessful. Species split off, coexist for enormous stretches of time, compete with each other, and in most cases, simply die out without leaving any descendants at all. For decades, the fossil record from the period between 3 and 2.5 million years ago was so sparse that scientists genuinely couldn't tell which picture was closer to the truth. We had Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, dated to around 3.2 million years ago, and we had early Homo species showing up a bit later. In between those 2 points sat a frustratingly empty gap, a stretch of time with almost no fossils to fill it in. And in science, an empty gap tends to get filled in with the simplest possible assumption. For a long time, that assumption was a straight line. The gap is not empty anymore. The gap started closing at a place called Ledi-Geraru, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, a stretch of eroded, sun-blasted badlands that has quietly become one of the most important fossil sites in the entire study of human origins. The project has been running since 2002, led for most of that time by paleoecologist K. Reed. And it's exactly the kind of place this research needs. Constant erosion means new sediment layers, and new fossils, are exposed every single field season. The site had already produced one landmark discovery back in 2013, a lower jaw belonging to early Homo, dated to roughly 2.8 million years ago, which was at the time among the oldest confirmed evidence of our own genus anywhere in the fossil record. That single jaw pushed the known origin of Homo back by hundreds of thousands of years. But it also raised an obvious question. If early Homo was already walking around 2.8 million years ago, what else was walking around with it? The 3 to 2.5 million year window is considered one of the single most important stretches in all of human evolution, because it's when the genus Homo first shows up in the fossil record, when the heavy-jawed Paranthropus lineage first appears, and when Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, seems to vanish entirely. 3 major events, all compressed into the same 500,000-year stretch, and almost no fossils from eastern Africa to actually document any of it happening. That's exactly the gap the Ledi-Geraru team set out to fill. And in 2025, they did. In 2025, the Ledi-Geraru team published the results of years of careful excavation in the journal Nature, and the centerpiece of the entire study was 13 fossil teeth. 13 small, unassuming pieces of enamel and dentin, recovered from the same layers of sediment, dated using the same precise geological methods that had placed the earlier 2.8 million-year-old jaw in time. And when the team analyzed exactly where in the sediment each tooth had come from, the dates told an extraordinary story. Fossils belonging to early Homo were found dated to 2.78 million years ago, and again at 2.59 million years ago. Fossils belonging to a species of Australopithecus were dated to 2.63 million years ago, sitting directly between those two Homo dates, in the very same location. This wasn't a case of one species appearing, disappearing, and being replaced by another millennia later. This was direct, overlapping, same place, same window evidence that early Homo and this Australopithecus species were alive at the exact same time, in the exact same valley. As K. Reid put it, describing the moment the dates lined up, here we have two hominin species that are together, not one giving way to the other, but two lineages sharing the same ground, the same resources, and quite possibly, the same watering holes, at the very same point in deep time. It's one thing to suspect that early human evolution wasn't a straight line. It's another thing entirely to hold physical, dated proof of two different lineages standing in the same place at once. Here's where the discovery gets even more interesting. The team's first instinct, reasonably, was to check whether these new Australopithecus teeth simply belonged to Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, which was already known to have lived in this general region. But when they compared the dental morphology carefully, the teeth didn't match. The proportions, the wear patterns, the overall shape, they were different enough that the team concluded this wasn't afarensis at all. It was something new. And that finding connects to another detail that's easy to miss but genuinely significant. There is still no confirmed evidence of Australopithecus afarensis anywhere younger than 2.95 million years old. Lucy's species appears to have vanished from the fossil record before this new Australopithecus, and before early Homo, even show up. Which means the old assumption, afarensis calmly and directly giving rise to Homo in one smooth transition, doesn't fit the timeline at all. Instead, there's a gap. Afarensis disappears. And sometime after that gap, at least two new lineages are already established and already coexisting, early Homo, and this new, not yet fully named Australopithecus species from Ledi-Geraru. The specimens can't yet be assigned to a specific species name. That process takes years of additional comparison and consensus building within the field, but the team was confident enough in the dental differences to state plainly that this was neither afarensis nor the previously known Ledi-Geraru. It's a genuinely new branch, discovered only in the last 2 years, sitting directly alongside our own. So who exactly makes up this crowded picture? Based on the combined fossil record from this window in time, researchers now count as many as 4 separate hominin lineages living in eastern Africa between roughly 3 million and 2.5 million years ago. There's early Homo, the genus that would eventually lead to us, though at this point still a relatively obscure, small-brained, small-bodied species, in no way guaranteed to be the one that survived. There's Paranthropus, the so-called robust cousin, built with a massive jaw and a bony ridge running along the top of its skull called a sagittal crest, an anchor point for enormous chewing muscles. Paranthropus was built to process tough, fibrous plant food, and by some estimates, may have been better adapted to its environment in the short term than Homo was. There's Australopithecus garhi, known from a partial skull dated to around 2.5 million years ago, with a build somewhere between the more ape-like earlier Australopithecines and the more human-like early Homo. And finally, there's the newly identified Ledi-Geraru Australopithecus itself, the species at the center of this whole discovery. And this crowded picture isn't limited to one valley in Ethiopia. Around the same broad time period, Australopithecus africanus was living in what is now South Africa, and other Paranthropus populations have been found in regions that are today Kenya, Tanzania, and southern Ethiopia. Zoom out far enough, and what you get isn't a single line marching toward humanity. You get an entire continent quietly running multiple evolutionary experiments in parallel, most of which were destined to fail. If the 2025 Ledi-Geraru paper had stood alone, it would already have been a major discovery. But it didn't stand alone for long. In 2026, a team led by researchers from the University of Chicago reported a new find from that same broader Afar region, a Paranthropus jaw, dated to approximately 2.6 million years old. Read that date again against the ones from the previous discovery. Early Homo at 2.78 and 2.59 million years ago. The new Australopithecus at 2.63 million years ago. And now, Paranthropus at 2.6 million years ago. 3 different lineages, 3 overlapping dates, all clustered within a window of less than 200,000 years, all from the same general region of Ethiopia. This is exactly the kind of independent confirmation that turns an intriguing single discovery into a genuinely established scientific picture. One surprising fossil find can always be an outlier, a fluke of preservation, a coincidence of dating. 2 independent finds, from 2 different research teams, pointing at the same conclusion, is much harder to dismiss. The Paranthropus jaw doesn't just add a third lineage to the roster, it reinforces the entire argument that this period in Eastern Africa wasn't a quiet, orderly handoff between species. It was, by any reasonable reading of the fossil evidence now available, an actively overlapping, multi-species landscape, with at least 3, and quite possibly 4, different kinds of hominins occupying the same general territory within the same relatively narrow slice of deep time. So what does all of this actually mean? According to Kay Reed, the researcher who has directed the Ledi-Geraru project for over 2 decades, it means the mental image most of us carry, an ape gradually straightening into a Neanderthal, then into a modern human, one clean step at a time, simply isn't correct. Evolution, in her words, doesn't work like that. What the fossil evidence actually shows is closer to a bushy tree than a straight line, multiple branches emerging from a shared root, many of them coexisting for long stretches of time, and most of them eventually going extinct without leaving any descendants at all. Early Homo happened to be the branch that survived and eventually diversified into every human species that followed, including our own. But at the moment these 4 lineages were sharing the Afar landscape, there was nothing inevitable about that outcome. Paranthropus, with its powerful jaw built for tough plant food, may well have looked like the safer evolutionary bet at the time. Garhi and the new Ledi-Geraru Australopithecus were both walking the same ground, following the same rivers, and facing the same environmental pressures. Any one of them, in principle, could have been the lineage that kept going. This is one of the genuinely humbling implications of the discovery. Modern humans are not the predetermined endpoint of some grand evolutionary plan. We're the surviving branch of what was, for a real and measurable stretch of deep time, a crowded and competitive field of possibilities, most of which simply didn't make it. It's worth being honest about what this discovery does and doesn't prove. Finding 2 or 3 species in the same sediment layers tells us they were alive during the same broad window of time, in the same general region. It doesn't automatically tell us they interacted directly, competed for the exact same resources, or ever laid eyes on one another. That's actually the next major question the Ledi-Geraru team is working to answer. Right now, researchers are analyzing the chemical composition of the fossil tooth enamel itself, a technique that can reveal surprisingly detailed information about what an individual actually ate during its lifetime, based on the specific isotopes preserved in the enamel as it formed. The goal is to figure out whether early Homo and this new Australopithecus species were genuinely competing for the same food sources, which would suggest real ecological pressure and possibly direct rivalry between the two, or whether they had already split into different dietary niches, one relying more heavily on tougher, fibrous plants and the other on softer, more varied foods, which would suggest they were coexisting more peacefully, simply by staying out of each other's way. Both scenarios are entirely plausible given what we currently know, and the honest answer is that researchers don't yet have enough data to say for certain which one is closer to the truth. That uncertainty isn't a weakness in the research, it's exactly how good science is supposed to work. The fossils have already overturned one major assumption. Figuring out exactly how these species related to each other, day to day, is the work still ahead. There's something worth sitting with here, once the science settles. Every one of us alive today belongs to a single, surviving twig at the very end of what was once a wide, branching, crowded tree. Early Homo wasn't obviously destined to be the lineage that made it. It was simply one competitor among at least three, and possibly more, all facing the same environmental pressures, the same shifting climate, the same search for food and water across the same stretch of ancient Africa. Paranthropus, built for durability, eventually vanished. Garhi's lineage appears to end. The new Ledi-Geraru Australopithecus, the very species whose discovery reshaped this whole picture, also seems to have left no confirmed descendants. Only one branch, quietly, kept going, through further speciation, further migration, further change, all the way down to every human being alive on Earth right now. That's not a story about inevitability. It's a story about survival against genuinely uncertain odds, repeated over and over across millions of years, by a lineage that had no way of knowing it would eventually succeed. The next time you see that old image, the single line of figures marching steadily toward humanity, remember what the teeth from Ledi-Geraru actually showed. Not a line. A crowd. Which detail changed how you think about your own family tree the most? That 4 species may have lived side by side, that most of our relatives left no descendants at all, or that the answer was sitting in 13 fossil teeth this whole time? Drop your answer below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the crowded, unfinished story of where we actually came from.